Time to take a look at Nebelwerfers. The literature on this subject is very thin. As such, a lot of the information in this video is from the German Army regulations located in the German military archive in Freiburg. And these visits were made possible by my supporters on Patreon and Subscribestar. Thank you very much, guys. Anyway, let's get started with the name. Nebelwerfer, literally translated, means fog thrower, which is due to the fact that in military Germany during World War II, smoke was called künstlicher Nebel, which means artificial fog. Additionally, a rocket launcher is also called a Raketenwerfer. Hence, the more meaningful translation would be smoke launcher. The Nebelwerfer units were part of the Nebeltruppe, meaning smoke troops literally, but better would be smoke arm. This arm was created in 1935, so the same year conscription was reintroduced. The role of the Nebeltruppe was basically that of a chemical corps, hence to use chemical agents and also defend against them. The handbook for general staff service during war from August 1939 notes, a smoke battalion is able to A. decontaminate terrain, B. contaminate terrain, C. to fire smoke and gas. The smoke battery is equipped as a detoxification battery. Of course, this role changed over the course of the war, since Nebelwerfer were often used to fire high explosive and flame oil as well. Since the Nebeltruppe was a very young and specialized arm, it was also extremely small. If we look at the initial strength in 1939, the Nebeltruppen just made up about 0.11% of the total field army. To put this in contrast, the artillery made up 12.92%. As such, it is not surprising that for 1939-1940 a mere 3 Nebelwerfer battalions were part of the field army, although one source notes that there were 4 battalions, of which one was a training unit. By May 1940, for the invasion of France, the number had reached 8 battalions. And for the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, the number reached 4 regiments and additional 7 battalions. These units were differently organized as well. Whereas infantry and panzer divisions had organic divisional artillery units, Nebelwerfer units were independent, similar to most of the heavy tank battalions with the Tiger and Königstiger. As such, they were assigned by higher command for specific duties. This might include temporary assignment to a division, but they were non-divisional units. Generally, Nebelwerfer units were fully motorized, although in late war there were some static werfers used as well. Yet those were the exception, not the rule. In terms of equipment, the initial equipment was the 10 cm Werfer 35 and its successor, the 10 cm Werfer 40. Both were basically heavy mortars. Yet when we think of Nebelwerfer, we mostly think of the later versions, namely the rocket launchers like the 15 cm Nebelwerfer 41, like this one from the museum in Oberloon in the Netherlands. The 15 cm Nebelwerfer 41 was tested in April 1940, but wasn't used during the Battle of France. It was a 6-tube launcher. As you might have noticed, these rockets don't have any fins for stabilization, unlike some of the Soviet Katyushas. This was due to the fact that the Germans used the spin of the rocket for stabilization. This was achieved by arranging the exhaust nozzles in a diagonal pattern. The data for a rocket with high explosives were as follows. It weighed 34.2 kg, the propellant made up 6.5 kg, and the payload was 2.4 kg. The maximum range was 6,900 meters. For the smoke rocket, the smoke plume had a radius of about 40 to 50 meters and stayed for about 40 seconds, under normal wind conditions. Notice there were different variants of this rocket, both in terms of payload and propellant. Additionally, it was used from 1940 to 1945. As such, there are different numbers out there as well, so take these as a baseline. Yet let us look at the tubes. They were numbered from left to right, as you can see here, yet they fired in the following pattern. First tube 1, followed by tube 4, then 6, then 3, then 5, and finally tube 2. You probably might already see why that was the case. If not, the reason for this was, in order to reduce the influence of the gas propulsion jet on the individual projectile paths, the firing cycle was carried out in such a way that the opposite tubes were always fired one after the other. Yet there was another interesting element here. If we look at the rocket, it looks rather conventional. But once we look inside, it gets interesting. since the payload with the actual explosives was located at the very end of the rocket, whereas the rocket fuel was located in front of it. As such, on impact of these rockets, the payload detonated at a height above the ground, given by the length of the propellant case. The effect against living targets was thereby substantially increased, and thus an effective replacement for the unavailable ground proximity fuse was found. Yet, since other rockets did not use this design setup, although other elements were reused, I assume that either the effectiveness was limited, the other rockets were employed differently, or design was not effective enough to justify the more complicated design. Sadly, I haven't found a definitive answer yet. Now, to increase the firepower, the propulsion of the 15 cm rocket was paired with larger warheads, namely the 28 cm high explosive and 32 cm flame oil, called 28 cm Wurfkörper Spreng and 32 cm Wurfkörper Flamm. As such, the range was significantly smaller. For the 28 cm high explosive rocket, it was 750 to 1925 meters, and for the 32 cm flame oil rocket, it was 875 to 2200 meters. Additionally, these rockets could be fired directly out of the transport crates. This feature was used by 3 different devices, namely the Schwere Wurfgerät 40, literally meaning heavy throwing device 40, its successor the Schwere Wurfgerät 41, and the Wurfrahmen 40, meaning throwing frame. Heavy throwing device sounds rather crude, and well, that was rather fitting, since it was basically a wooden or metal tube frame to put 4 transport crates on. The 40 version being made of wood, and the 41 version, which was its successor, with metal tubes, as you can see here. Now, the Wurfrahmen 40 was a frame that could be mounted on vehicles, something you probably know from Company of Heroes. Now, I'm not entirely sure here if these units were necessarily part of the Nebeltruppen, since in MD's book, which is one of the few books about the Nebeltruppe, I found 2 photos of the Sonderkraftfahrzeug 251 with a throwing frame, and it notes in both cases that these belong to the pioneers. Yet back to the 28 and 32 cm rockets, because there was also a dedicated Nebelwerfer that could fire them, namely the 28 cm/32 cm Nebelwerfer 41. Unlike the previous 15 cm Nebelwerfer 41, it had no tubes. It was basically a frame with 2 rows of 3 rockets each. MD notes about its origin. The heavy throwing device was stationary, very sensitive to shelling, and could not always be used because of the small firing range. As such, it was imperative to develop a movable launching rack for the same ammunition. Thus, the 20/32 cm Nebelwerfer 41 was created. Although take this with a grain of salt, since I don't have access to the original design documents. Anyway, the German Army regulation describes this Nebelwerfer as follows. The 28/32 cm Nebelwerfer 41 is a special weapon for firing large caliber ammunition with a new type of propulsion. With appropriate ammunition use, the greatest effect on a target area can be achieved in the shortest possible time by means of suddenly launched mass fire. Although reloading took quite some time. The 28/32 cm Nebelwerfer is a sextuplet and shoots in the lower angle group. It fires 6 shots, 1 salvo in 10 seconds. 20 cm projectiles explosive or 32 cm projectiles flame. It takes about 5 minutes to reload. In terms of range, the regulation notes the maximum firing range is 1925 meters for explosive projectiles and 2200 meters for flame projectiles. The shortest firing distance is 1250 meters. The most favorable firing distances are between 1700 and 1900 meters. Notice that the shortest range is quite larger than those given with the Wurfgerät 40 and 41. Now, the firepower of the 28/32 cm Nebelwerfer was considerable. The problem was it had only a maximum range of 2200 meters, but it also had a considerable minimum range. Hence, this could lead to tricky situations, since it had to be placed close to the front, but if the enemy got too close, it couldn't be used properly. This likely led to the 21 cm Nebelwerfer 42, which had a maximum range of 7850 meters, which was far more than the 28/32 cm one and even more than the 6900 of the 15 cm Nebelwerfer. It used the mount of the 15 cm Nebelwerfer, but it only had 5 tubes. Additionally, if insertion rails were used, it could also fire the 15 cm rocket as well. As such, it was a rather versatile weapon. The next one in line was the 30 cm Nebelwerfer 42, which was very similar in looks to the 28/32 cm Nebelwerfer 41. So no tubes here. In terms of performance, a quote from the Army regulation: the 30 cm Nebelwerfer 42 is a sextuplet. It fires 6 shots in 10 seconds, equally 1 salvo. And you can repeat this every 3 minutes. The maximum firing distance is 4550 meters. The shortest firing distance 1000 meters. For the purpose of close defense, it is also possible to shoot below 1000 meters. See firing table. Although not really a Nebelwerfer, the next one is important, namely the Panzerwerfer 42 or 43, depending on the source. Luckily, I have a reprint of wartime datasheets, so I looked and there it is called 15 cm Panzerwerfer 42, 15 cm Nebelwerfer 41 auf Selbstfahrerfette. Now, the Panzerwerfer 42 came in 2 variants. The first one was based on the Opel Maultier, meaning mule. It was a truck converted to a half-track. Later, the Panzerwerfer was based on the Schwere Wehrmachtsschlepper. The Panzerwerfer was fitted with a 10-tube 15 cm launcher, so it was armed with the 15 cm Nebelwerfer 41, although with 4 tubes more and a different pattern. Note that the vehicle was only lightly armored, so it was protected against shrapnel and the backblast of the rockets itself. One of the last Nebelwerfer was the 30 cm R-Werfer 56. It had no tubes and, like the other larger launchers, used frames. Additionally, it should function as a standardized werfer. As such, it had insertion rails to allow to fire 15 cm ammunition as well. The upper part was that of the 30 cm Nebelwerfer 42, which was mounted on the 5 cm Panzerabwehrkanone 38 mount. The maximum range was depending on the ammunition and was thus either 4500 or 6900 meters. According to MD, this weapon was introduced in October 1944. Additionally, it shows up in the reprints of the data sheets from wartime. Yet I also found a reprint of a document for the Organisationsabteilung, the organization department, from December 1944, which listed weapons of the different categories. Here, the 30 cm Werfer is not listed, where both the 10 cm Nebelwerfer 35 and 40 are listed. Additionally, 2 other weapons which I haven't covered yet are listed under Nebelwerfer as well, namely the Leichte Ladungswerfer and Schwere Ladungswerfer, meaning literally light and heavy charge thrower. Interestingly, these weapons are neither listed or shown in the Velcro articles nor MD's book about the Nebeltruppe, although the US Handbook on German Military Forces lists them as 20 cm Leichter Ladungswerfer, calling it a light spigot mortar with some basic description in the photo, whereas the other one is called the 38 cm Schwerer Ladungswerfer with no photo, and the note that no details are available for this weapon and that its existence was derived from finding a 38 cm high explosive spigot mortar shell. Sadly, I don't know much more about these weapons. Next, let's look at some basics that most of the Nebelwerfers shared. First off, unlike regular artillery, Nebelwerfer, except the mortar variants, were fired with electricity. A current surge generated by a rotation with the handle of the 6-volt ignition machine, transmitted through the 30-meter long cable, ignited a small powder charge by means of a glow igniter. Additionally, the operators are lying nearby in a slit trench to be safe from the backblast. In terms of organization, the basic unit was the battery. Regular artillery batteries in early war usually contained 4 guns. But for the Nebelwerfer it gets interesting. The early batteries, which had the 10 cm mortars, had 8 mortars per battery. Although later batteries, like those of the 21 cm or 28/32 cm Nebelwerfer, had 6 werfers per battery. Yet there's another interesting aspect. One source noted, tactical unit was the battery, which however from the beginning contained 6 launchers and was often accompanied by an anti-tank gun. As mentioned, early batteries had 8 guns, so that information is not entirely true, and I was very suspect about the anti-tank gun claim, because it made very little sense to me, since first, I rarely heard of anything like that, although it is a rather obscure topic. But second, one singular weapon is rarely used within a military unit as well. As such, I looked at some tables of equipment and organization, and also an army regulation, and indeed, I found at least 2 instances where a single anti-tank gun was part of a Nebelwerfer battery according to regulation. To quote from the Army regulation for the Heavy Werfer battery, on the vehicle of the Platoon Leader 2 Sonderkraftfahrzeug 10-1, the anti-tank gun is carried along. The crew consists of the platoon leader, the ammunition NCO, 1 light machine gunner, 3 anti-tank gun crewmen, and 1 driver for the special vehicle, Kraftfahrzeug 10-1. This anti-tank gun was used for close defense, since after all the Nebelwerfer had a minimum range. In contrast, artillery was equipped with armor-piercing shells. Whereas a Nebelwerfer was not, and also a significant larger blast radius for the rocket as well, thus threatening its own crew. Generally, Nebelwerfer rockets were far more sensitive than artillery shells. As such, Nebelwerfers were less versatile than regular artillery. To quote from an Army regulation, the explosive shell is an explosive projectile with a highly sensitive percussion fuse for engaging live targets. Therefore, it does not penetrate the ground and is not suitable for engaging covered targets. Note, this was for the 10 cm Nebelwerfer, which was basically a mortar, but it is also valid for rockets fired by later Nebelwerfers. Speaking of firing rockets, this produced a lot of smoke and kicked up dust. The smoke was reduced later on when a different rocket fuel was introduced, but in comparison to artillery, a Nebelwerfer was still highly visible during firing and afterwards. In case of strong enemy artillery superiority, the flame trail of the projectiles prohibits the delivery of longer lasting fire and extended remaining in a fire position. Therefore, multiple targets must be engaged quickly, one after the other, or from different firing positions. Interestingly enough, Emden notes something about changing positions that differs from the regulation. Sadly, he does not explain this decision. Later, we learned that it is more practical to stay in good foxholes and not to change positions immediately. To protect the tires from damage, the wheels were removed. But this always meant an additional wheel fitting when changing positions. Well, I hope you learned something new about Nebelwerfers. A big thank you here to my Patreons and Subscribestar supporters that make videos like this that are based mostly on archive visits possible. Special thanks to Andrew for reviewing the script. As always, sources are listed in the description. Thank you for watching and see you next time.